on June 26, 1944 at Hollandia Air Base in Dutch New Guinea. Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald found himself interrupted during what should have been a routine evening of checkers. The man standing at his screen door had introduced himself quietly, but the name hadn't fully registered as MacDonald remained focused on his game with Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith, Satan's Angels operations officer. When the civilian repeated his introduction with unmistakable confidence, MacDonald finally looked up to see Charles Lindbergh, America's most famous aviator, standing in their makeshift recreation hall, thousands of miles from home, requesting permission to discuss P-38 combat operations. Neither man could have anticipated that this seemingly casual interruption would fundamentally transform long-range fighter operations across the Pacific theater. Over the following 6 weeks, Lindbergh would teach techniques that extended the combat radius of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning by nearly 400 miles, converting what pilots considered impossible into standard operating procedure. This transformation represented more than technical innovation. It embodied the triumph of specialized knowledge over institutional resistance, of mathematical precision over pilot instinct, and of one man's unique mastery changing the trajectory of aerial warfare in the Pacific. The path to that screen door in Hollandia had begun 17 years earlier over the Atlantic Ocean. On May 21, 1927, Charles Augustus Lindbergh had revolutionized aviation by flying 600 miles from New York to Paris alone in 33.5 hours. The Ryan NYP monoplane he piloted, Spirit of St. Louis, carried 450 gallons of fuel in tanks so large they blocked forward vision. Lindbergh had navigated by periscope and dead reckoning, managing fuel consumption with precision that would have seemed obsessive to other pilots of that era. He landed at Le Bourget Field with 85 gallons remaining, having achieved fuel economy that experts had considered impossible for a Wright whirlwind radial engine. That meticulous attention to fuel management became Lindbergh's defining technical expertise. Throughout the 1930s, conducting survey flights for Pan American Airways across the Pacific and Atlantic, Lindbergh refined techniques that extended range far beyond manufacturer specifications. He understood that published range figures represented averages, not limits. Every engine possessed an optimal operating envelope where power output, fuel consumption, and mechanical stress reached perfect balance. Finding that envelope required understanding the relationship between manifold pressure, propeller RPM, mixture settings, and indicated airspeed in ways that transcended standard training. By 1944, Lindbergh had become one of the world's foremost experts on long-range flight, but his relationship with the United States military remained complicated by his pre-war isolationism. He had argued passionately against American involvement in European conflicts, leading the America First Committee and earning President Franklin Roosevelt's enmity. On April 29, 1941, after Roosevelt publicly compared him to Civil War Confederate sympathizer Clement Vallandigham, Lindbergh resigned his Air Corps Reserve Colonel's commission. When Pearl Harbor forced America into war, Lindbergh attempted to rejoin the Army Air Forces. Roosevelt personally ensured Lindbergh would never wear an American military uniform again during the conflict. Yet expertise finds its way. Unable to serve as a military officer, Lindbergh became a civilian technical consultant for aircraft manufacturers. He joined United Aircraft Corporation in 1943, working extensively with their Chance Vought division, producers of the F-4U Corsair. His technical contributions were enormous, but Lindbergh hungered for combat. By early 1944, he identified an opportunity. United Aircraft wanted to study the feasibility of a new twin-engine fighter. The only American representative of that category was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Lindbergh convinced United Aircraft to send him to the Pacific Theater as a technical representative to observe P-38 operations under combat conditions. What began as an observation assignment evolved when Marine Corps aviation officers invited Lindbergh to fly as an observer on combat missions. On May 21, 1944, Lindbergh flew his first combat sortie, a strafing run with Marine Fighting Squadron 222 near the Japanese garrison at Rabaul. Working with Corsair pilots, he He demonstrated how to safely take off with bomb loads double the F-4U's rated capacity. The Marines had been losing aircraft to overweight accidents. Lindbergh's careful analysis of power settings, takeoff speeds, and weight distribution reduced accidents while increasing strike capability. Word spread through the Pacific theater that the famous aviator was flying combat missions as a civilian and solving operational problems that had stumped military pilots for months. By mid-June 1944, Lindbergh had grown interested in the P-38 Lightning, having heard that the 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, was one of the premier Lightning units in the Pacific. On June 20th, Lindbergh spent an hour and 20 minutes getting checked out in a P-38 with the 35th Squadron of the 8th Fighter Group. His first time in the distinctive twin boom fighter. 6 days later, he flew to Hollandia and walked in on MacDonald's checkers game. MacDonald was 29 years old and already a 10 victory ace commanding the 475th Fighter Group, which had been activated in Australia on May 14, 1943, and had since become one of the highest-scoring P-38 units in the theatre. The group's 3 squadrons flew the latest P-38J models with improved intercoolers and additional fuel capacity. These Lightnings represented the longest-range fighters in the Pacific, capable of missions no other aircraft could fly. Yet even with dropped tanks, the P-38's operational radius remained limited. Missions to distant targets left little fuel for combat maneuvering, and pilots frequently returned to base with uncomfortably low fuel reserves. After brief conversation, MacDonald asked Lindbergh if he'd like to fly a mission the next day. The mission would launch at dawn, and rather than return to headquarters, MacDonald suggested Lindbergh stay at the 475th camp to eliminate transportation problems. As Lindbergh settled into the spare cot, word spread rapidly through the unit Charles Lindbergh was flying with Satan's Angels. On the morning of June 27, 1944, Lindbergh prepared for his first P-38 combat mission. MacDonald led 4 aircraft toward Jeffman Island and Samet Airfield, regular targets for the 475th. The mission involved strafing an enemy barge in Caveying Bay. Lindbergh wove through anti-aircraft fire, his cannon and machine guns raking the target. All 4 aircraft returned safely, but what the crew chiefs noticed after landing would prove more significant than any combat action. When ground crews checked Lindbergh's P-38 after several missions, they discovered a pattern. His aircraft consistently returned with substantially more fuel remaining than other pilots flying identical missions. After a 6.5-hour armed reconnaissance mission on July 1st, Lindbergh landed with 210 gallons of fuel remaining, while other pilots from the same mission returned with fuel gauges showing near-empty tanks. MacDonald noticed the discrepancy and called a meeting. 2 days after Lindbergh's arrival, the colonel gathered the 475th's pilots in their recreation hall, a crude facility with packed dirt floors beneath a palm-thatched roof. Under glaring unshaded light bulbs, MacDonald introduced Lindbergh formally and asked him to explain how he consistently returned with more fuel than any other pilot in the group. What happened next would change P-38 operations throughout the Pacific theater. Lindbergh stood before the assembled pilots and explained cruise control techniques he had developed for the Lightning. The standard operating procedure taught to all P-38 pilots called for cruising at 200 to 400 RPM with mixture set to auto-rich. This setting provided good power and was considered safe for the engines, but it was wasteful. Lindbergh explained that by reducing engine speed from the standard 200 RPM down to 600 RPM, setting the fuel mixture to auto, lean rather than auto-rich, and slightly increasing manifold pressure to compensate for the lower RPM, pilots could dramatically reduce fuel consumption without losing effective cruise speed. The specific settings he recommended were 600 RPM at 30 inches of mercury manifold pressure with mixture set to auto, lean and indicated airspeed of 185 mph. These settings reduced fuel consumption to approximately 70 gallons per hour, achieving about 2.6 miles per gallon. Compared to standard cruise settings consuming significantly more fuel, the savings were enormous. Lindbergh predicted these techniques would stretch the Lightning's radius by 400 miles, enabling 9-hour missions. When he concluded his presentation half an hour later, the room fell silent. The pilots wrestled with several uncomfortable thoughts. The notion of a 9-hour flight did not appeal to men who already found 7-hour missions punishing. More troubling was Lindbergh's recommendation to run engines at settings they had been specifically taught to avoid. The combination of low RPM and high manifold pressure was called running over square. Military flight training emphasized that over-square operation would damage engines, causing cylinder heads to overheat and leading to catastrophic engine failure. The skepticism in the room was palpable. Several pilots exchanged glances. Some shook their heads, and one pilot openly called Lindbergh's technique dangerous. But MacDonald understood something important. Lindbergh was not speaking from theory. He had flown combat missions using these settings without engine problems, returning repeatedly with fuel reserves that provided operational flexibility other pilots lacked. Over the next week, pilots began cautiously experimenting with Lindbergh's cruise settings. The initial flights were short, allowing quick returns if engines showed distress. The first pilots to try the technique reported nervously that their engines sounded different at the lower RPM, but temperature gauges remained normal. Oil pressure stayed within acceptable ranges, and cylinder head temperatures, the critical indicator of detonation, actually ran cooler than at higher RPM settings. As confidence grew, pilots began using Lindbergh's techniques on longer missions. The fuel savings were undeniable. The P-38's effective combat radius, previously about 570 miles, extended to 100 miles, then 750 miles. Pilots discovered they could reach targets that had been considered beyond the Lightning's capability, fight for 15 minutes over the target area, and still return with a 1-hour fuel reserve. The transformation was revolutionary. Lindbergh explained the physics behind the technique in ways that helped pilots understand why it worked. By reducing RPM and increasing manifold pressure, the same power could be produced with fewer combustion cycles, each using fuel more efficiently. The lean mixture setting further improved efficiency by providing just enough fuel for complete combustion, eliminating the excess used in auto-rich mode for engine cooling at high-power settings. The technique was not dangerous. It was simply different from what pilots had been taught. Lindbergh's expertise came from years of experience with long-range flight. His 1927 Atlantic crossing had taught him that published specifications were starting points, not limits. The P-38 had an advantage that made experimentation less risky: twin engines. If one engine suffered damage, the other could bring the pilot home. By late July 1944, Lindbergh's cruise control techniques were spreading throughout 5th Air Force P-38 units. The 475th Fighter Group's success was impossible to ignore. Word spread to other squadrons through pilot conversations and ground crew fuel consumption data comparisons. Other commanders wanted the same operational advantage Satan's Angels now enjoyed. On July 28, 1944, Lindbergh experienced his most dramatic moment with the 475th during a bomber escort mission to the Seram area. Flying with the 433rd Squadron over El Paputi Bay, Blue Flight encountered two Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonyas, Japanese light bombers returning from searching for a missing comrade. The engagement turned into a running battle. Captain Saburo Shimada, commanding officer of the 73rd Independent Flying Chitai, piloted one Sonya when proved to be an experienced pilot with no intention of dying easily. For 30 minutes, the Japanese captain outmaneuvered multiple attacking P-38s, throwing his aircraft into violent banks and maximum rate turns that allowed the slower Japanese aircraft to turn inside the faster American fighters. Then Shimada did something unexpected. Rather than continuing evasive maneuvers, he turned directly toward the approaching Lindbergh. The two aircraft flew at each other head-on at a closing speed of nearly 500 mph. For Lindbergh, a man who had flown thousands of hours but never faced an enemy aircraft trying to kill him, the moment crystallized with terrible clarity. Lindbergh instinctively sighted on the Sonya's radial engine and pressed his trigger. The P-38's armament, one 20mm cannon and four 50 caliber machine guns concentrated in the nose, erupted for 6 seconds. Bullets and shells slammed into the front of the Sonya. The Mitsubishi's propeller visibly slowed, smoke poured from the engine, but Shimada held his course. At the last moment, Lindbergh pulled up violently, his P-38 passing over the damaged Sonia with feet to spare. Shimada's aircraft went into a steep dive, continuing until it hit the ocean at high speed. A fountain of white spray marked the impact before the waves merged back into the sea. Captain Saburo Shimada and his observer were dead. Unofficially, the pilots agreed Lindbergh had scored his first and only kill, though the victory was not entered in the Fall 75th's official war record since Lindbergh was a civilian. 3 days later, on August 1st, Lindbergh nearly died during a fighter sweep to the Palau Islands. In the ensuing dogfight with Japanese Zeros, Lindbergh found himself in a turning fight with a Zero pilot who very nearly shot him down. Only MacDonald's intervention saved Lindbergh's life. The close call convinced 5th Air Force headquarters that enough was enough. On August 12, 1944, Lindbergh left Hollandia to return home. The pilots of the 475th Fighter Group gathered to see him off, their respect genuine. He had not just taught them techniques that extended their combat radius. He had flown with them, fought with them, and proven himself in conditions where rank and fame meant nothing. The impact of Lindbergh's fuel efficiency techniques extended far beyond the 475th Fighter Group. By October 1944, P-38 units throughout the Pacific were using variations of his cruise control settings. The operational implications were profound. Targets that had been unreachable became accessible. Japanese bases that had enjoyed immunity from fighter escorts now faced P-38s with enough fuel to fight over the target and return home safely. The range extension was not trivial. In the second half of 1944, the increased combat radius enabled operations that directly supported MacArthur's advance toward the Philippines. Airfields that could not have been supported by existing fighter ranges became viable forward bases. Operations that would have taken months were completed in weeks because fighter cover could reach farther faster. The technique also saved lives. Pilots who previously returned to base with fuel gauges showing empty now had reserves for emergencies. Bad weather that forced detours no longer meant certain loss of aircraft. The fuel reserves provided a safety margin that directly reduced combat losses from non-combat causes. By late 1944, Lindbergh's cruise control technique was officially incorporated into P-38 operating procedures. What had begun as a civilian technical representative's observation had become standard doctrine. The U.S. Army Air Forces published updated cruise control charts for the P-38 that reflected Lindbergh's discoveries. The technical specifications of what Lindbergh accomplished reveal the magnitude of improvement. The P-38J Lightning had internal fuel capacity of 410 gallons in standard tanks, with provisions for external drop tanks bringing total capacity to over 1,000 gallons. Lindbergh's technique reduced consumption to approximately 70 gallons per hour total. Combat radius increased from approximately 570 miles to 750 miles with the same combat and reserve allowances, a 31% improvement. These capabilities transformed Pacific operations. The strategic island hopping campaign that characterized MacArthur's advance relied on air superiority at each stage. Fighter range determined which islands could be bypassed and which required direct assault to provide airfields. By extending fighter range, Lindbergh's techniques allowed bolder operational planning. The story highlights the sometimes uncomfortable relationship between expertise and institutions. Lindbergh's pre-war political positions had made him unwelcome in official military service, yet the Army Air Forces needed exactly the expertise he possessed. The solution: unofficial civilian status with informal authorization to participate in combat, was irregular but worked. Institutional rigidity gave way to operational pragmatism, benefiting the war effort immeasurably. Charles Augustus Lindbergh died on August 26, 1974, at age 72 from lymphoma at his home in Kipahulu, Maui. His wartime journals, published in 1970, provided detailed accounts of his Pacific service, including his time with the 475th. The legacy of Lindbergh's Pacific service extends beyond the specific techniques he taught. He demonstrated principles that remain relevant. Technical expertise matters in combat operations. Civilian specialists can contribute meaningfully if given opportunity. Institutional procedures should be questioned when evidence supports change, and personal demonstration is more persuasive than abstract argument. In the final analysis, Lindbergh's achievement in the Pacific represents a unique intersection of specialized expertise and operational necessity. The Pacific theater demanded extreme range from fighters. Existing procedures limited range below what aircraft were technically capable of achieving, and Lindbergh possessed unique knowledge in fuel management spanning decades. He had the courage to demonstrate his techniques personally, risking his life to prove his theories, and the humility to work with pilots as an equal rather than demanding recognition for his fame. The pilots of Satan's Angels knew what Lindbergh had given them. They flew farther, fought longer, and returned safer because of knowledge shared freely by a civilian who understood fuel efficiency better than anyone else in the Pacific. That knowledge, proven in combat and adopted throughout the theater, represents one of the most successful technical innovations of the Pacific Air War. It came not from laboratories or engineering departments, but from one man's specialized mastery of an art he had perfected 17 years earlier over the Atlantic Ocean, a mastery that proved as valuable in 1944 as it had been in 1927.